In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in war, there are those who are forgotten not by death, but by something far more terrible. This is the story of Shasui Kaoyon, whose name means shadow strike in the Tao tongue, though few remember it now. For in the wasteland of Zirion Prime, names become luxuries that the living can ill afford. Section 1. The Phantom of the Ruins. The crimson sun bleeds across the broken skyline of Hive Mortalis, casting long shadows through the skeletal remains of what once housed millions. Here, in this monument to imperial decay, something moves with purpose among the rubble. The figure is hunched, wrapped in tattered cloth that might once have been the pristine white and ochre of Tau battle dress. But time and survival have stripped away such civilized distinctions. The creature, for that is what the locals call it, picks through debris with mechanical precision, searching for salvage with the methodical thoroughness of a military mind. Its movements are wrong, somehow. Too fluid for human anatomy, yet lacking the ceremonial grace that marks the Tau species. This is adaptation written in sinew and bone, the terrible compromise between what was and what must be to survive. A pulse rifle, its casing cracked and field repaired with imperial components, rests within easy reach. The weapon itself tells a story of gradual corruption. Tau technology, married to human ingenuity through desperate necessity. The creature's hands, blue-gray and marked by radiation scars, move with the confidence of one who has learned to make such compromises without hesitation. The wind carries the distant sound of Imperial Guard patrol boots against broken rockcrete. The figure freezes, every instinct honed by months of hunted existence. The pulse rifle is in its hands before conscious thought completes the action, and in that moment, watching from shadows that have become its natural habitat, the creature that was once Shasui Kaoyon embodies the fundamental horror of the 41st millennium, the price of survival when civilization fails. Section 2. The Weight of the Greater Good. To understand the magnitude of this fall, one must first comprehend what Shasui Kaoyon once represented. The fire caste of the Tau Empire stands as the military arm of a society built upon the philosophical foundation of the greater good, the Tauva, that binds every citizen to the collective advancement of their species. For the Tau, individual desire is subordinate to racial destiny, and personal survival means nothing if it does not serve the whole. Kaoyon had embodied this ideal with the fervor of the truly faithful. Rising through the ranks of the fire warriors through demonstrated tactical acumen and unwavering loyalty to ethereal guidance, they had earned the name Shadow Strike for their ability to appear where enemies least expected, delivering precise death in service to Tau expansion. Their pulse rifle had ended 347 human lives across a dozen worlds, each death a calculated step toward bringing the light of the greater good to a galaxy drowning in ignorance and superstition. The world of Zirion Prime had seemed no different from the others. Imperial Guard regiments, the 47th Zirion Rifles and 203rd Vostroyan Mechanized, had established defensive positions across the planet's primary hive cities. Standard Tau doctrine called for methodical advance, overwhelming firepower coordinated through drone support, and the inexorable application of superior technology. The campaign was projected to conclude within 6 Terran months, after which the human population would be offered the choice between incorporation into the Empire or relocation to worlds better suited to their primitive capabilities. Kaoyon's cadre had been assigned to the northeastern assault vector, tasked with eliminating Imperial artillery positions that threatened the main Tau advance. It should have been routine, a surgical strike followed by rapid withdrawal to allow drone squadrons to exploit the breach. The greater good demanded nothing less than perfect execution, and Kaoyon had never disappointed the ethereals who shaped Tau destiny through their wisdom and guidance. None of them had anticipated the orbital bombardment. Imperial tactics rarely embraced the destruction of their own infrastructure, but the 47th Zirion had been reinforced by Cadian advisors who understood the mathematics of acceptable loss. When the battlecruiser Righteous Fury opened fire from high orbit, the bombardment was indiscriminate, devastating Tau and Imperial positions alike in a calculated gamble to break the alien advance through sheer destructive force. Section 3. The Birth of Isolation. The world exploded into light and thunder. Cao Yun's last coherent memory of their former existence was the sight of Shazel Mien, their cadre leader, vaporized in the initial bombardment alongside 3 other fire warriors. The communion helms that linked every Tau warrior to their battle brothers fell silent, replaced by the terrible absence that no member of their species had ever been forced to endure the crushing weight of absolute solitude. When consciousness returned, Cao Yun found themselves buried beneath 2 meters of rubble, their battlesuit systems flickering between operational and critical failure. The bombardment had lasted for 17 minutes and 34 seconds, during which the primary Imperial defensive line had ceased to exist alongside most of the Tau assault force. The mathematical precision of the attack was almost admirable, a willingness to sacrifice immediate tactical assets for strategic advantage that would have earned grudging respect from Tau commanders had any survived to appreciate it. But Cao Yun was alive, and that simple fact represented the first crack in their ideological foundation. Tau doctrine provided no framework for individual survival when separated from command structure and fireteam support. The greater good demanded that isolated warriors either rejoin their forces or die gloriously in service to the Empire's advancement. There was no provision for the grinding reality of day-to-day survival behind enemy lines, no protocol for the slow erosion of purpose that comes with abandoned duty. The first 72 hours passed in attempts to re-establish communication with Tau forces. Cao Yun's suit systems had been damaged but not destroyed, and they possessed emergency beacon protocols designed for exactly this situation. But the electromagnetic interference from the bombardment, combined with active Imperial jamming, created a communications dead zone that extended for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The beacon calls went unanswered, disappearing into static that gradually became indistinguishable from silence. By the 4th day, with suit power reserves critically low and no sign of friendly forces, Cao Yun faced their first ideological crisis. Tau battle doctrine dictated honorable death rather than capture or extended isolation. The pulse pistol contained sufficient charge for a single shot, and fire warrior training included precise anatomical knowledge for quick termination of suffering. But somewhere in the pain-hazed hours following the bombardment, a new imperative had taken root, one that had no name in the Tau language because it had never been needed. The simple, animal desire to continue existing, regardless of purpose or propriety. The decision to survive represented Cao Yun's first step away from everything they had been raised to believe. And in the ruins of Zirion Prime, with Imperial patrols growing closer each day, that single choice would prove more destructive than any weapon the enemy could deploy. Section 4, the erosion of faith. Survival behind enemy lines demanded compromises that Tau philosophy had never contemplated. The first was abandonment of the battlesuit, whose distinctive silhouette and energy signature made concealment impossible. Cao Yun stripped the armor piece by piece, salvaging power cells and targeting systems while leaving the ceramic plates to be buried beneath rubble that might hide their origin from casual Imperial observation. Dressed in scavenged human clothing, the rough weave fabric chafing against skin evolved for different atmospheric conditions. Cao Yun began the process of learning to be invisible. This required studying human behavior with the analytical mindset of a military intelligence operative, observing the survivors who emerged from the ruins to forage for supplies and clean water. The way humans moved was inefficient, driven by emotion rather than tactical consideration, but their very randomness provided advantages that Tau precision could not replicate. The first month of survival established routines that would have horrified the ethereals. Cao Yun learned to eat human field rations, their digestive system gradually adapting to proteins and carbohydrates evolved for different metabolisms. They practiced mimicking human posture and gait, developing the slouched, irregular movement patterns that would allow them to pass unnoticed among refugees and displaced civilians. Most significantly, they began thinking in Gothic Low rather than Tau, the crude efficiency of the human language proving better suited to the immediate concerns of finding food, water, and shelter. Each adaptation represented another step away from the greater good. Tau society was built upon the principle that individual excellence served collective advancement, but isolation had reversed that equation. Now, collective knowledge served individual survival, and the philosophical implications of that reversal grew more disturbing with each passing day. Kaoyon found themselves applying tactical analysis, not to serve the Empire's expansion, but to ensure their own continued existence, a perversion of the fire caste training that felt like blasphemy against everything they had been taught to revere. By the second month, the compromises had become routine. Kaoyon had established a base camp in the lower levels of a ruined administratum building, using imperial construction techniques learned through observation to create concealed shelters that could withstand both weather and casual inspection. They had learned to hunt the oversized rats that infested the ruins, using improvised snares that bore no resemblance to Tau hunting traditions but proved effective at providing necessary protein. Most disturbing of all, they had begun to understand human social dynamics well enough to predict patrol routes and civilian behavior with tactical accuracy. The knowledge that they were becoming something neither fully Tau nor acceptably human grew like a tumor in Kaoyon's consciousness. Each successful day of survival proved that the individual could exist without the collective, a heretical concept that undermined the fundamental assumptions of Tau civilization. And as imperial forces established more permanent control over the ruins, the pressure to integrate more completely with human society grew beyond mere tactical necessity into existential requirement. The moment of recognition came during the 7th week, when Kaoyon realized they had been unconsciously thinking of the ruins as home rather than temporary shelter. The distinction seemed minor, but it represented a conceptual shift that would have been incomprehensible to their former self. For a Tau warrior, home was wherever the Empire needed them to serve. But for the creature that survival was creating, home had become simply the place where they could continue to exist from one day to the next. Section 5. The fever of transformation. The psychological breakdown began during the 3rd month, when isolation transformed from tactical disadvantage to existential horror. Kaoyon had always known themselves, through their relationship to other Tau, their position within the fire team, their role in the cadre's tactical doctrine, their service to the greater good as interpreted by ethereal wisdom. But alone, with no context for self-definition beyond the basic requirement of continued breathing, identity began to fragment along stress lines that Tau psychology had never been forced to accommodate. The hallucinations started as simple auditory phenomena, phantom vox transmissions in Tau battlecant, imagined orders from commanders who no longer existed. Kaoyon would find themselves responding to tactical updates from fire team members whose names they spoke aloud to empty air, conducting briefings for mission objectives that would never be completed. These episodes provided temporary relief from the crushing weight of solitude, but their aftermath left an even deeper appreciation of the fundamental wrongness of individual existence. Sleep became elusive, haunted by dreams in which ethereal Aun El Tau Canon delivered judgment upon the cowardice of survival without purpose. In these visions, Kaoyon stood before the Council of the Highest, their shame exposed for all to witness a fire warrior who had chosen personal continuation over glorious service to the greater good. The dream ethereals spoke with voices like wind through bone, demanding explanation for choices that had no justification within Tau moral framework. And always, the dreams ended with the same terrible question: what are you now, if not what you were made to be? The fever broke during a period of delirium brought on by infected wounds and contaminated water. For 72 hours, Kaoyon existed in a state between waking and unconsciousness, their body temperature fluctuating beyond safe parameters, while their mind constructed elaborate fantasies of rescue and redemption. In these fever dreams, Tau forces had never withdrawn from Xerion Prime. The bombardment had been repelled, the Imperial defenders crushed beneath the inexorable advance of superior technology and tactics. Kaoyon was discovered wounded but alive, their survival celebrated as evidence of fire caste determination and resourcefulness. But consciousness always returned, bringing with it the cruel recognition that rescue was not coming. The Tau Empire had written off Xerion Prime as a strategic loss, accepting the destruction of an entire hunter cadre as the price of maintaining operational security elsewhere. Kaoyon's survival meant nothing to the greater good if it could not be communicated, analyzed, and incorporated into future tactical doctrine. They had become strategically irrelevant, a status that, for a being raised to believe in the paramount importance of collective advancement, represented a form of death more complete than physical termination. Recovery from the fever brought a clarity that was itself terrifying. The psychological frameworks that had defined Cao Yun's existence had been stripped away by isolation, leaving behind something that could think and plan and act, but which had no ideological foundation for those activities beyond the simple imperative of survival. This was not madness in any traditional sense indeed. Cao Yun's tactical thinking remained as sharp as ever, but it was a madness of purpose, the terrible sanity of a mind functioning perfectly within a context that should not exist. The realization that they were losing their language came gradually. First, tactical terms in Tao began requiring conscious effort to recall, replaced by Gothic equivalents that carried subtly different conceptual implications. Then personal memories began shifting. Conversations with fire team members remembered in translation rather than original language. Finally, they caught themselves thinking of their own name not as Cao Yun, but as Shadow, the human approximation that was easier to incorporate into cover identities and false documentation. By the end of the crawl's fourth month, the transformation was essentially complete. The creature that emerged from the fever was capable of tactical thinking, long-term planning, and sophisticated analysis of human behavior patterns, but it was no longer capable of believing in the greater good as anything more than an abstract concept, a philosophical curiosity from a previous existence that had ended beneath the rubble of imperial bombardment. Section 6. The moment of absolute choice. The breaking point arrived with the execution of captured Tao prisoners, an event that crystallized every compromise and adaptation of the previous months into a single moment of irreversible decision. Cao Yun had been observing Imperial forces from concealment when the transport arrived, carrying 7 survivors from other hunter cadres who had been captured during the failed assault. The prisoners were in poor condition, wounded, malnourished, but maintaining the disciplined bearing that marked them as true servants of the greater good. From their hidden position, Cao Yun watched as Imperial Commissar Valdus conducted the interrogation with methodical brutality. The Tao warriors revealed nothing of tactical value, their conditioning proving superior to human persuasion techniques. But what struck Cao Yun most profoundly was not their resistance to torture, but their continued faith in eventual rescue. Even facing execution, the prisoners maintained absolute belief that the Empire would return for them, that their sacrifice served some greater strategic purpose that individual understanding could not encompass. The execution itself was conducted with the casual efficiency that marked Imperial military practice. 7 pulse rifle shots, delivered with Tao weapons that had been recovered from battlefield salvage. The irony was deliberate. Commissar Valdus had a reputation for psychological warfare that extended beyond simple intimidation into active demoralization of enemy forces. The use of captured Tao technology to kill Tao prisoners was intended as a message, a demonstration that Imperial forces could turn any advantage against its original creators. Cao Yun had the tactical position and firepower to intervene. Their salvaged pulse rifle contained sufficient charge for a dozen shots, more than enough to eliminate the execution squad and create an opportunity for prisoner extraction. Imperial response time would provide a window of perhaps 8 minutes before reinforcements arrived, sufficient for a fighting withdrawal to prepared fallback positions. Standard fire warrior doctrine mandated immediate action to preserve Tao lives and deny the enemy psychological victory. But intervention would mean exposure, the end of months of careful concealment, and the virtual certainty of death or capture within days. The tactical mathematics were clear: 7 lives against 1, with the probability that all 8 would ultimately be lost if rescue was attempted. From the perspective of individual survival, the choice was obvious. From the perspective of everything Cao Yun had once believed about duty and sacrifice, it was unthinkable. The moment of decision stretched across an eternity of heartbeats. Cao Yun's finger rested against the pulse rifle's firing stud, their crosshairs centered on Commissar Valdus with the unconscious precision of firecast training. A single shot would begin a cascade of violence that would end only with death, either theirs or the enemy's, but certainly, and finally. The alternative was to remain hidden, to watch fellow Tao warriors die, while preserving their own existence for purposes that no longer had any meaning beyond the simple continuation of biological function. When Commissar Valdus gave the order to fire, Cao Yun's weapon remained silent. The choice had been made through inaction. a decision to prioritize individual survival over collective loyalty that represented the complete inversion of every principle they had been raised to embody. The execution proceeded with mechanical precision, 7 more deaths added to the countless millions that marked the ordinary operation of imperial justice. But for Cao Yun, those 7 deaths marked something far more significant than tactical failure or personal cowardice. They marked the moment when the last vestiges of Tao identity finally died, leaving behind something that could think and plan and kill with all the efficiency of a fire warrior, but which owed allegiance to nothing beyond its own continued existence. The creature that watched Imperial forces dispose of Tau bodies was no longer capable of believing in causes greater than survival, no longer burdened by ideological frameworks that demanded sacrifice for abstract principles. Freedom, Cao Yun discovered, was indistinguishable from damnation. Section 7. The Hybrid Predator. What emerged from the crucible of absolute choice was something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history of warfare. A being that combined Tau analytical precision with human survival instinct, creating capabilities that neither species possessed in isolation. The psychological frameworks that had once limited Cao Yun's tactical thinking to prescribed doctrinal parameters were gone, replaced by an adaptive flexibility that could incorporate any advantage without regard for ideological consistency. The first manifestation of this transformation was in combat methodology. Standard Tau tactics emphasized overwhelming firepower delivered from optimal range, with engagement parameters carefully calculated to maximize technological advantages while minimizing risk to firecast personnel. But survival behind enemy lines had taught Cao Yun the value of human approaches to warfare, the willingness to accept suboptimal conditions in exchange for tactical surprise, the use of deception and misdirection to achieve objectives that direct confrontation could not secure. The synthesis of these approaches created a fighting style that was neither recognizably Tau nor conventionally human. Cao Yun learned to use improvised explosives constructed from Imperial ordnance, combining human demolition techniques with Tau engineering principles to create devices of extraordinary sophistication and lethality. They developed infiltration skills that surpassed anything in fire warrior training, using knowledge of human psychology to predict patrol patterns and security procedures with uncanny accuracy. Most significantly, they learned to kill without conscience or hesitation, viewing targets not as fellow sapient beings deserving of tactical respect, but as obstacles to continued survival that required efficient removal. This represented a fundamental shift from Tau military philosophy, which treated warfare as an extension of diplomacy designed to advance the greater good through demonstration of superior capability. For the creature that Cao Yun had become, violence was simply another tool, no more morally significant than any other means of achieving necessary objectives. The adaptation extended beyond combat skills into comprehensive lifestyle changes that would have been impossible for either pure Tau or human psychology to accommodate. Cao Yun learned to eat anything that provided necessary nutrition, including protein sources that would have triggered instinctive revulsion in their former existence. They developed the ability to sleep in any conditions, their nervous system adapting to remain alert for danger while allowing essential rest in environments that offered no genuine security. Language became fluid, shifting between Gothic Low, Hive Cant, and the specialized jargon of military units depending on situational requirements. The Tau language was reserved for moments of stress or extreme concentration, when tactical analysis required the precision that only their native tongue could provide. But increasingly, even complex strategic thinking occurred in human linguistic frameworks, the concepts that had once required Tau philosophical terms now expressible through cruder but more immediately practical Gothic vocabulary. By the 8th month of isolation, Cao Yun had achieved a level of integration with human society that approached the supernatural. They could move through Imperial Guard installations without triggering suspicion, their understanding of military hierarchy and bureaucratic procedure sufficient to forge convincing documentation and establish plausible cover identities. When necessary, they could function as a completely effective member of human military units, their tactical expertise and combat skills earning them rapid acceptance within organizations desperate for experienced personnel. But this integration came at a cost that was only gradually becoming apparent. Each successful deception, each moment of acceptance within human society required the suppression of responses and instincts that had once defined Tao identity. The careful control of body language to mimic human emotional expression, the modulation of vocal patterns to eliminate the subtle tonal variations that marked Tao speech, the conscious adoption of human social behaviors that felt like a form of psychological contamination. All of these adaptations were necessary for survival, but they represented the systematic erasure of everything that had once made Kaoyon recognizably a member of their species. The final stage of the transformation was the most disturbing: the gradual loss of any desire to return to Tao society. The greater good, which had once provided meaning and purpose for every aspect of existence, began to seem like a distant abstraction, a philosophical luxury that beings engaged in moment-to-moment survival could not afford to indulge. The hierarchical certainties of Tao civilization, the guidance of ethereal wisdom, the comfort of knowing one's place within a larger purpose, all of these began to feel not like lost treasures, but like constraints that would interfere with the flexibility and adaptability that survival demanded. By the end of the first year behind enemy lines, the creature that had once been Shazui Kaoyon was no longer capable of believing in anything beyond the immediate requirements of continued existence. And in that loss of faith, they had gained something that neither species could provide: the terrible freedom of existing without purpose beyond the next day's survival. Section 8. The price of adaptation. The long-term consequences of Kaoyon's transformation extended far beyond personal psychological damage into implications that would reshape both Tao and Imperial understanding of xenobiology and military psychology. The creature that eventually emerged from the ruins of Xerion Prime represented a form of adaptation that neither species had anticipated, and its existence raised questions about the fundamental nature of identity, loyalty, and survival that military theorists would debate for generations. From the Tao perspective, Kaoyon's survival represented a catastrophic failure of philosophical and biological assumptions that underpinned their entire civilization. The idea that a Tao could exist in prolonged isolation without psychological collapse challenged the fundamental premise of the greater good, that individual identity was meaningless without collective purpose. Water-caste analysts, who eventually studied the case files, would spend decades attempting to understand how fire-caste conditioning had failed so completely, and what this implied about the psychological resilience of their species under extreme conditions. The ethereal response was predictably swift and absolute. All records of Shazui Kaoyon were expunged from official military files, their name removed from unit rosters and casualty reports, as if they had never existed. The philosophical implications of their survival were deemed too dangerous for general knowledge within Tao society, potentially undermining the ideological certainty that held their expansion-based civilization together. Future fire warrior training would incorporate additional psychological conditioning designed to ensure that individual survival never took precedence over collective advancement, no matter the circumstances. But the Imperial perspective proved equally disturbing in its implications. Commissar Valdos had continued tracking the rogue Xenos for months after the prisoner execution, eventually piecing together evidence of a Tao survivor who had achieved unprecedented integration with human society. The tactical reports he filed with regimental command described infiltration capabilities that exceeded anything in Imperial xenobiological databases, raising concerns about the possibility of long-term Tao espionage operations that could evade standard detection protocols. The Inquisition's interest was immediate and intense. Ordo Xenos interrogator Vex Calandra arrived on Xerion Prime within 6 months of Valdos's initial reports, bringing with her a retinue of specialists trained in xenopsychology and counterintelligence operations. The investigation that followed would reveal evidence of Tao adaptation that challenged Imperial assumptions about alien psychology just as profoundly as it had disturbed Tao philosophical frameworks. Calandra's final report, classified at the highest levels of inquisitorial authority, painted a picture of xenobiological adaptation that was both tactically invaluable and strategically terrifying. The possibility that other alien species might possess similar adaptive capabilities raised questions about the effectiveness of traditional Imperial counter-Xenos operations while the implications for long-term espionage and infiltration suggested security vulnerabilities that existing protocols were inadequate to address. The broader galactic impact of Karyon's transformation would not become apparent for decades, but the precedent they established would eventually influence military doctrine across multiple species and sectors. The concept of survival adaptation beyond species parameters became a recognized phenomenon in xenobiological research, leading to new protocols for prisoner interrogation, psychological warfare, and counterintelligence operations that accounted for the possibility of fundamental identity transformation under extreme conditions. For the creature that had been Shazui Karyon, the long-term consequences were more immediately personal and infinitely more tragic. The skills and adaptations that had ensured survival had also ensured permanent isolation from both species whose characteristics they now embodied. Too alien for complete acceptance within human society, too contaminated by individual survival for any possibility of return to Tau civilization, they had achieved a form of existence that was sustainable but fundamentally hollow. The records suggest that Karyon eventually established a form of life within the lower levels of Hive Mortalis, operating as a freelance military advisor and tactical consultant for various human organizations that valued expertise over ideological purity. Their reputation for tactical brilliance and absolute reliability made them valuable to resistance movements, criminal organizations, and even legitimate Imperial Guard units that needed specialized knowledge without awkward questions about its source. But success in this new existence could not address the fundamental emptiness that had replaced everything they had once believed about purpose and meaning. The creature that had survived the unsurvivable had paid for that survival with the loss of everything that had once made survival worthwhile. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, that transaction represented perhaps the most common form of victory that individuals could hope to achieve. Section 9. The Ripple Effect. The phenomenon that Karyon represented was not unique, though it would take decades for either Imperial or Tau forces to recognize the pattern. Across the galaxy, wherever prolonged warfare created conditions of extreme isolation and survival pressure, similar transformations were occurring with disturbing frequency. The psychological mechanisms that enabled individual survival when separated from species-specific support structures were revealing themselves to be far more adaptable than military theorists had previously understood. Tau water caste researchers, working under direct ethereal supervision, eventually identified 47 documented cases of fire warriors who had survived extended periods behind enemy lines across 12 different sectors. Of these, 31 had undergone psychological transformations severe enough to prevent reintegration with standard Tau military units. The implications of this data were so disturbing that access was restricted to the highest levels of Tau command authority, with distribution limited to those ethereals directly responsible for fire caste training and deployment. The research revealed that the transformation process followed predictable stages that appeared to be independent of individual psychological factors or specific environmental conditions. Initial separation trauma, followed by survival adaptation, ideological breakdown, identity reconstruction, and finally complete psychological reorganization around individual rather than collective survival imperatives. The consistency of this pattern suggested that it was not an aberration of Tau psychology, but rather a previously unknown adaptive mechanism that had evolved as a response to extreme stress conditions. From the Imperial perspective, similar patterns were emerging among human forces subjected to equivalent isolation pressures. Astra Militarum psychological evaluation units began documenting cases of soldiers who had survived extended periods behind enemy lines and returned with behavioral modifications that made them unsuitable for standard military service. These individuals demonstrated enhanced tactical thinking, improved survival skills, and psychological resilience that exceeded normal human parameters, but they also showed decreased responsiveness to standard command authority and reduced effectiveness within traditional unit structures. The Departamento Munitorum's response was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than attempt to understand or prevent the transformation process, Imperial authorities began developing protocols for identifying and utilizing these adaptive survivors as specialized assets for unconventional warfare operations. The skills and psychological flexibility that made them unsuitable for standard military service proved valuable for deep reconnaissance, insurgency operations, and other assignments that required prolonged independence from command support. Inquisitor Calandra's expanded investigation eventually revealed that the transformation phenomenon was not limited to Tau and human forces. Similar adaptations had been documented among Eldar Rangers who had been separated from their craft worlds for extended periods, Orc survivors who had been cut off from the psychic influence of their Warg, and even isolated Tyrannid bioforms that had survived the destruction of their Hive fleet connections. The consistency of adaptive responses across radically different species suggested that the phenomenon represented a fundamental biological response to extreme survival conditions rather than a species-specific psychological quirk. The theoretical implications were staggering. If individual survival adaptation could override species-specific social programming across such diverse biological and psychological frameworks, then the fundamental assumptions about species behavior that underpinned military doctrine might be flawed. The possibility that any individual, given sufficient isolation and survival pressure, might develop capabilities and loyalties that transcended their original species. Programming represented a challenge to established strategic thinking that no military theorist was prepared to address. The practical implications were equally disturbing. If the transformation process was predictable and replicable, then it could potentially be weaponized. Enemy forces might deliberately create conditions designed to trigger adaptive transformation in captured personnel, producing individuals who retained their original species capabilities while developing loyalties aligned with their captors' objectives. The potential for long-term espionage and infiltration operations was limited only by the time and resources required to create and maintain the necessary psychological conditions. But perhaps the most disturbing implication was the suggestion that traditional concepts of species loyalty and cultural identity might be far more fragile than anyone had previously understood. If individual survival could override collective programming so completely, then the ideological frameworks that held galactic civilization together might be vulnerable to systematic undermining through the deliberate creation of survival stress conditions. The response to this possibility varied predictably across different species and organizations. Tau ethereals implemented additional psychological conditioning designed to strengthen collective identity programming and prevent individual adaptation. Imperial authorities developed new security protocols for identifying and neutralizing potentially compromised personnel. Other species adapted their own procedures based on similar concerns about the reliability of traditional loyalty mechanisms. But the creature that had been Shazui Kaoyon remained largely unaware of the broader implications of their transformation. For them, the academic debates about xenopsychology and military doctrine were abstract concerns that had no bearing on the immediate requirements of day-to-day survival. The ripple effects of their adaptation would influence galactic military thinking for generations. But those consequences were as irrelevant to their personal existence as the greater good they had once served with absolute devotion. Section 10. The Eternal Stranger. In the end, what remains of Shazui Kaoyon is a question that haunts the darkest corners of military philosophy. What defines identity when every framework for self-understanding has been stripped away by necessity? The creature that haunts the ruins of Xerion Prime possesses memories of being Tau, skills derived from human adaptation, and capabilities that belong to neither species completely. They are a living testament to the horrible adaptability that survival demands, and to the price that individuals pay when civilization fails to provide the security that its promises assume. The final records of Kaoyon's existence paint a picture of functional adaptation that never quite achieves peace or satisfaction. They continued to operate within the gray areas of human society, their tactical expertise making them valuable to organizations that could overlook questions of origin and species classification. But the reports suggest a profound isolation that went beyond mere physical solitude into existential territory that neither Tau nor human psychology was equipped to navigate. There were attempts at connection, relationships with humans who could accept their alien nature in exchange for the protection and tactical advantage that their skills provided. But these connections inevitably failed, when the fundamental differences in psychological structure became apparent. Humans who could overlook blue skin and unusual anatomy found it impossible to relate to a mind that processed emotional attachment through survival calculations, that evaluated trust based on tactical advantage rather than affection or loyalty. Equally significant were the few encounters with Tau forces that occurred in later years, when expanding Imperial conflicts brought Fire Warrior cadres back to Xerion Prime for strategic objectives that had nothing to do with Kauion's original mission. These meetings revealed the complete impossibility of return or reconciliation. The being that approached Tau positions was no longer recognizable as kin, their behavioral patterns and psychological responses having diverged too far from species norms for any meaningful communication to occur. The Tau warriors who encountered this hybrid creature reported it to their ethereal supervisors as a form of enemy psychological warfare, an Imperial attempt to create confusion and disruption through the deployment of some unknown xenobiological weapon. The idea that the creature might once have been a member of their own species was literally inconceivable within the philosophical frameworks that define Tau understanding of identity and loyalty. The greater good could not accommodate the possibility that individual survival might create something that was neither enemy nor ally, but simply other. From the Imperial perspective, Kauyon represented a useful asset whose origins were less important than their capabilities. The various human organizations that employed their services cared little about the philosophical implications of their transformation, focusing instead on the tactical advantages that their hybrid nature provided. But even this pragmatic acceptance was limited by the fundamental inability of human social structures to accommodate beings who existed outside traditional categories of alliance and identity. The creature that had been Shazui Kauyon was condemned to perpetual alienation, too changed for return to their origins, too alien for complete integration with their adoptive society. They had achieved the survival that they had chosen over duty and honor, but that survival came with a cost that was perhaps worse than the death they had. Avoided the knowledge that they belonged nowhere and to no one, that their continued existence served no purpose beyond the maintenance of biological function. In the broader context of the 41st millennium, Kaoyon's story represents one of the countless personal tragedies that fuel the galaxy's endless wars. They are a reminder that survival, in itself, is not victory, that the preservation of life without meaning or purpose is its own form of death. The grim darkness of the far future offers no consolation for those who discover that adaptation can be indistinguishable from corruption, that the price of continuing to exist may be the loss of everything that once made existence worthwhile. But perhaps there is a different lesson in Kaoyon's transformation, one that speaks to the terrible resilience of consciousness when confronted with impossible circumstances. The ability to continue functioning, to find new frameworks for existence when old ones collapse, to create identity from the fragments of what was lost. These represent forms of strength that transcend species boundaries and philosophical systems. The creature that haunts Xerion Prime may be alone, but they are also proof that individual will can survive even the complete destruction of the contexts that once gave it meaning. In the ruins where their story began, under the crimson sun that has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations beyond counting, the figure that was once Shazui Kaoyon continues to move through shadows that have become their only home. They are neither Tau nor human, neither hero nor villain, but something more fundamental and more disturbing, a consciousness that has learned to exist without purpose, beyond its own continuation, a mind that has discovered the ultimate freedom of having nothing left to lose. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that may be the closest thing to victory that anyone can hope to achieve.